Tuesday, 27th of January, 2026, and the last remaining Israeli hostage in Gaza is home. Yesterday, confirmed that the body that the IDF had returned to Israel, which was believed to be the body of the counter-terrorist police officer Ron Gvili, who had been murdered by the Hamas in battle, killed by the Hamas, murdered by the Hamas in battle on October 7th, 2023, taken to Gaza, and was believed to be the first Israeli taken to Gaza on that day, has been returned to Israel by the IDF after they searched through a mass grave of reportedly some 250 or so people. They found his body. They brought him to the Abu Kabir Forensic Institute in Israel, and there he was positively identified by the forensics experts. That means that the last Israeli hostage that was being held in Gaza is now back in Israel, and his family will not only have a proper funeral for him, but it gives them a sense of closure and also a sense of peace that they know where he lays and where he will rest in peace. The reason that this is, of course, a very important day is on many different levels. First of all, Israel has been fighting tooth and nail for more than 2 years to get every last hostage out of Gaza. And despite the so-called ceasefire that was put into effect back in October and the numerous violations of it, the Hamas had failed to produce the last hostage and was basically dragging their feet. And ultimately, it was none other than the IDF itself, which took charge of the situation, discovered his body, and then the Israeli Forensic Institute confirmed his identity. So once again, the Hamas was not credible, did not live up to their word, did not do what they had agreed to do, and did everything they could to obstruct that process from happening. But now we have a situation where, for the first time since 2014, there are no Israeli hostages being held, dead or alive, in Gaza. Literally since then, there have been hostages in Gaza until yesterday, when it was confirmed. So 843 days after the start of the war on October 7th. There's about 12 years, or at least 11 and some months, that there have been people stuck in that relatively small piece of land who should have been at home in Israel instead, but were being held alive or dead by Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or other groups in the Gaza Strip. This brings closure not only to the family of Ron Gvili, but also to the nation of Israel, which has been waiting for his return, for the end of that terrible chapter in our times. Now, of course, Israelis have to be ever vigilant because of the fact that just because we got the last hostage home does not mean that Palestinian terrorists and others would like nothing more than to kidnap more Israelis. And they plot and try to do that on a regular basis. And their plots are foiled with regularity by the Israeli security forces, because we know this is something they actively try to do. They try to capture soldiers, they try to capture civilians, they just try to capture anybody who's Israeli or is in Israel, even if they're not Israeli, even if they're not Jewish. Furthermore, what this signals is now Hamas and the other groups who are basically terrorist organizations akin to Hamas in Gaza, like the PFLP, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, etc., Al-Aqsa Martyrs, whatever you want to call them, all these different groups, they have no more material leverage over Israel in the Gaza Strip. And yet, they still have not surrendered their weapons. They still have not withdrawn from power. They still have not withdrawn from politics. These are things that they agreed to do when they signed a 20-point peace plan, or 20-point Trump plan for Gaza, whatever you want to call it. The plan that was signed in October of 2025 has basically been violated constantly since it was signed, not only by violent ceasefire breaches, right, on literally the first day when it was signed, within a couple of hours of it being signed, 2 Israeli soldiers in Gaza were killed by an RPG attack shot at them by Hamas. Israel then responded to it because that's what you do when somebody violates the ceasefire. There isn't a ceasefire anymore. And then they reinstated the ceasefire, and it happened again, in a different attack shortly after. And again, Israel responded, and again, they reinstated the ceasefire. And they've violated the ceasefire many dozens of times already, more than there have been days since then. Practically, at least, I think so, roughly. If not more than, pretty close to. Definitely more than 50 or 60 times already. If not more than 100 or 200. But at least 50 or 60 times. In the last 4 months, let's say. So, what this tells us is that the Hamas never had any intention of following through on the plan, even though they signed on it, but they said out loud, we don't intend to do this, even after they signed it. They said we have no intention of doing anything other than exchanging hostages for prisoners. That was their only thing. They said they would never agree to give up their weapons, even though they signed on the paper that they would. They said they would never withdraw from power, even though they signed on paper that they would. They said they wouldn't withdraw from politics, even though they signed on paper that they would. And now you have Trump's so-called peace board, or board of peace, which gives people or countries a 3-year membership, or they can pay $1 billion to be on it permanently. What happens in 3 years? Think about this. Trump's presidential term ends. And I bet you, especially if a Democrat is elected next, that the board of peace will fizzle into nothingness. So the 3-year option is basically be on this thing for, the duration of his term in office. And anybody who's a sucker enough or wants to have more influence on this board will pay $1 billion to be listed as a permanent member. And some countries have accepted this $1 billion offer. Many countries have not. Some countries have been told that the cost would be defrayed or paid by somebody else. Israel initially objected to it and then came around to it because Bibi doesn't want to upset Trump during his term in office. But at the same time, Israel objected to this because the so-called Board of Peace for Gaza includes members that Israel strongly objects to having any presence in Gaza, namely Turkey and Qatar. So it is actually smart for Israel to be on the board for now in order to block any such an attempt, if possible. And it has to be said that Qatar and Turkey are 2 of the worst possible countries to put on such a board that would in any way have any influence over what happens in Gaza, because for years and decades, really, they have not only given housing to members of the Hamas political class, but they have funded them to the tune of billions of dollars. They provided them with logistical support, moral support, material support, and media support, political support, and other kinds of support. So they literally are the enablers of Hamas. Yes, of course, they also got a lot of money and training and supplies from Iran and the IRGC specifically. But Turkey and Qatar who are ostensibly supposed to be friends with the United States and, not the most virulent anti-Israel countries on earth, are in fact among the most anti-Israel countries on earth. And their friendship with the United States should at the very least be questioned because of their actions, not just vis-a-vis Israel, but vis-a-vis U.S. interests in the Gulf and in the Middle East and in Iran in general. Yes, Turkey has interests in Iran, and Turkey very much wants to see the dictatorship remain in place, because if the dictatorship is replaced by democracy, then Turkey's role and strategic position as a NATO member becomes less and less significant, and they know it, and they are very much afraid of losing that status, despite the fact that they've already really lost it in public, in the opinion of people who understand what is happening in the world. Right? Turkey has, for a long time, purchased goods from Russia for its actual defense, unlike Israel, which purchases Russian goods usually for reverse engineering. You could say that's for defense, but it's not to use the supplies themselves. It's to give that intel to the United States and to have that intel for itself. Turkey is very much a friend of, the leader of Turkey is very much a friend of the leader of Russia. And Erdogan is a friend of Putin. He is barely a NATO ally. The reason Turkey is still a NATO ally is because Turkey gets a lot of benefit from being a NATO ally politically. And practically speaking, they remain a NATO ally because they still have nuclear weapons for the United States. They house U.S. nuclear weapons that are aimed at Russia if, God forbid, a nuclear war should ever happen, and the United States would need to respond, quickly. They can fire weapons from Turkey to Russia. That's why NATO membership was offered to Turkey in the first place, way back in the day, when Turkey was in fact a much more pro-U.S. country and a much more pro-Western country. But now, since they've elected Erdogan many years ago, and the country remains under his authoritarian rule, Turkey is increasingly an Islamist country, supported by his AK party. And they have no intention of being very friendly to the West, despite the fact that they are NATO members. They are constantly a thorn in the NATO side. They are constantly a thorn in anything the United States tries to do in this region. And they use any political weight that they have to interfere with U.S. plans. Not only that, the political class in Turkey, namely Erdogan and his minions, constantly do everything they can to deride Israel, which is ostensibly still a relatively friendly country with Turkey, and with whom Israel actually does a lot of joint military operations. Right? Yes, many of them have been canceled over the past number of years, but a lot of them have still gone on. So Israel and Turkey's military do have a relatively close relationship, and they continue to have that, and probably will well into the future. But we do have these problems that I've mentioned and discussed here, specifically regarding Turkey's relationship and sustenance given to Hamas. So now that Hamas has no more leverage in Gaza, it is really incumbent upon the so-called international force of observers that are in a base in Kiryat Gat, Israel, that are monitoring activity in Gaza, that are seeing basically no change on the ground, right? Nothing new happening, no withdrawal from power, no withdrawal from politics, no disarmament. It is a pure, unadulterated violation of this so-called plan. And Trump is basically pushing it off. And even though he said multiple times that if Israel wanted to, they could go and finish the job if Hamas didn't honor the deal, the fact is that Hamas has not honored the deal. Israel should finish them off, but is being pressured not to do so by the very administration that says, no, it has the right to do that. So if you've ever wondered what a political cluster bang looks like, well, you're looking at it in Gaza right now. That is exactly what we have. It is not a great situation for Israel. Yes, we did get our last hostage home. Thank goodness for that. But Hamas should have been forced to disarm at the outset of this deal and not at the tail end of getting back the last hostage, because in the meantime, they've been able to regroup, resupply, and retrain and rearm, basically prepare for more fighting and possibly even another October 7th style attack if they are not removed from power. And that cannot be. And the fact that Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has failed to force Hamas to disarm and to step away from power is yet another reason why a lot of Israelis think the guy should retire. He should resign. He has not lived up to his promises. Not at all in this case. That doesn't mean that he did a terrible job managing a 7-front war. Arguably, no. I would say he has not. But he still, I think, should have resigned on October 7th, but he didn't, and he did manage to at least effectively conduct the fight across, like I said, 7 different fronts. So, and you could argue, well, it's the generals that really did that. Sure, but he is still the prime minister, so he gets the credit and the blame. So that's the long and short of it. I'll bring you more soon. At the moment, that's what we have. Take care. Peace.